200 pesos or something. So maybe, maybe that is having an effect on the results. And that is the end of the presentation. Thank you.
So we have like half an hour for questions.
Yes.
All of the research has been based on something which is being called color. And I just wonder whether there's been any research done on facial characteristics, face features. I wonder if that might be an element that should be.
Yeah, so, and I'm glad you pointed that out. So in here, as I said, so we have the two that's kind of getting in color. So one is actual skin tone, and then the other is how people identify as their race or color. In terms of the physical features, this survey doesn't have it. I'm actually doing some work right now where but it's only in 3 cities, so Salvador, Sao Paulo, and Rio, where I did collect data on hair type, physical, well, also skin color. I'm trying to think what else we have in there. We definitely have hair type and skin color. It's to try to get at some of the physical features that, you know, could also explain how people talk about discrimination. Yes.
The matter of Preto, you have the 51%. And following up on this year, I think what one hears in terms of DNA in the Brazil population, it's probably closer to 100.
Yeah, so for the 51%, that is, that's just saying 51% of the population identifies in census categories as Preto or Pardo. But yeah, as you are pointing out, of course, you have to look at DNA, it's much higher. And even this, I think they began to have, you know, over majority status officially. That was in, I think it was 2010. But again, that's only going by census data, and that was due to more Afro-Brazilians identifying as Preto. So these aren't, you know, real numbers. It's more of like about identification. And someone, I think, one of the research centers, they're now saying is 53 or 54%. But these, again, aren't real demographic changes. It's based on self-identification. And that's all related to what I talked about before, affirmative action policies, as well as more people actually claiming blackness and embracing blackness.
But sorry about that, but the data that you're using from the laptop, that is self-reported. So
Yes.
people so respondents report I am black or brown for
Yes,
the...
based on census categories.
And what are the...
The census categories are Preto,
Uh-huh.
Pardo, Amarelo for Asians,
Uh-huh.
Indigenous, and Branco white.
And what is the proportion of blacks and browns in the sample?
In the
laptop
pop sample.
Yeah.
Let me see. I have it here.
So it's, the question is really, are there more blacks or browns? So blacks, the group of blacks, the proportion of blacks is larger than the proportion of browns?
In the
laptop sample?
no.
The other way
No,
around?
the laptop pretty much mirrors the actual
That was going to be the
census one. Yeah, so I think, I mean, this is off the top of my head, but it's maybe 46 to 48%
Uh-huh.
say that they are brown in the official
Okay.
census. And then the other, you know, if it's 46 and 7%, you know, this is for the 53% I was talking about earlier, are saying that they are Preto. But yeah, so, but this one mirrors pretty much, I don't think I have it in here, but it's very similar. So you have more Afro-Brazilians that identify as brown. Oh, wait a minute, I think I might have it there. Okay, the 2012 survey has 1,500 respondents, and of the 1,449 responding to the color race question, 14% Actually, I think that's 2010 survey. 14% self-identify as Preto, and 44% self-identify as Parda. So in this sample, it's 58% Afro-Brazilian. Once you take out the people who didn't mention the race or color question.
Mhm.
So that, of course, that's higher than the 53%. But it's still that most identify as Parda.
Right.
Did the work provide for a working definition of what discrimination is, or was it left to the individual to self-define discrimination? In other words, the extent of discrimination varies from waiting too long at a restaurant to not getting a job. Both discriminatory but different things.
Yeah, so that's the thing. And I do think there is an older LaPop survey that we can use where they do actually have these different categories to say, have you experienced discrimination at work? Have you experienced discrimination? I think it just kind of generally says like in a public place. And then I forgot the other categories. But I do know they have those too. I think it's a little bit older, but yeah, we might have to go with another survey. If that's what you're saying, since this one, you know, is a general one. But yeah, this one, you know, we don't know what people are thinking about when they say never, you know. Are they thinking about at work, public settings, home settings? Yeah, we don't have a clue from the survey question. Yes.
Yeah, I was wondering if you consider any like cultural aspects about race, like somebody might look black but might be culturally considered brown, or like is that even play a role there, or it's just like looking at the physical characteristics but not the cultural part?
Can I compliment?
So are you saying in terms of how they answer the question about discrimination?
Yeah, and how they consider themselves, like how do they think I'm black or brown, but just basically because how I look or how I culturally interact with myself?
Yeah, so one thing that the only thing I can tell you from the data is that, you know, like the finding, if your skin is darker, you're more likely to report experiencing discrimination. Now, is it possible that dark-skinned people identify as brown? Yes, people do, yeah. So, I guess if you're trying to, that is not something I could actually answer with a survey data. When another person had brought up this, the point about physical features and things like that, that's stuff that I have in my own work where I could try to get at that, where I use both quantitative and qualitative data, but there's really no way I can get at that with, with this survey.
Do you think that would change with the results if the cultural aspect will be included somehow?
In terms of reporting, I'm assuming you're talking about in terms of reporting.
Yeah, record this week.
Right, so if you, for example, okay, there's some work that gets at this, I think, a little bit. So this is for the category of Pardo, which is the more ambiguous category. So Hayes and Leon, this is 2012, found that Pardos identify differently within the group of Pardos. So some Pardos identify as Pardo and Negro, and their identification is Negro. And it's often due to experiencing discrimination or being aware of discrimination against Negros. On the other hand, there are some Pardos that only discuss their identity as Pardo due to racial mixture in their family or their birth certificate. And when mentioning discrimination, claim they have never faced it because their skin color is in the middle of white and black. So I think that is kind of getting at what you're talking about, so that there are some people who they do identify differently, you know, in different situations, but it's due to that experience of discrimination. There's another paper that I have with William Darity where we actually look at the endogeneity of race. So that's the idea that if you are black, you're more likely to report discrimination. However, for people who experience discrimination, they are more likely to identify as black. So it's hard to entangle which direction it goes. Of course, this one, their findings indicate that for Pardos, that if they experience discrimination, then they are more likely to identify as Negro. So again, it's kind of getting back to what I talked about in terms of activism, for people who start to interpret their situations differently, to say that, oh, this was based on race, not just my class, then that changes the way they see themselves, regardless of skin color.
But building on that question, something that I would be worried is about your like theoretical framework. Just because I think there are historical differences between Latin America in general, let me say, and the US experience. I will be afraid that the scheme of like bringing the US experience on race and discrimination to Latin America without qualifying the theoretical framework is very dangerous, because the results are going to be like kind of difficult to really grasp and live on them. Let me give you a couple of examples.
But I didn't do that, actually. So, you know, sorry for interjecting, but I didn't do that. These are all based on Brazil. So, and this is why I talked about the current state of racial politics.
This is based on Brazil, but
This
what
is
the
Brazil.
theoretical
And even
framework to
the
understand
scholars that I
race?
cited here, these are people doing work on Brazil. Silva and Reis, Marcelo Paixão, Angela Figueiredo, they're all Brazilians. These aren't people with American frameworks. These are Brazilians doing work on Brazil, and this is what they found.
But these guys,
So that's where I got my hypothesis.
okay, they are Brazilians, but they have some sort of framework that make a difference, make differentiation between like what is the experience in the United States or the experience. or
No, they
Latin
only
America
talk
or
about
Brazil, or is
Brazilians.
there is no need to do that.
No, they only talk about Brazilians. They're not, like, this work isn't, and that's why I cited, so Angela Figueiredo, her work is on Salvador, Brazil, Salvador da Bahia, Brazil. And then Silva and Reis, their work is on Rio de Janeiro. They're not doing work on Brazil in the US. Marcelo Paixão, his is more national, but it's only on Brazil. So this is, and actually this is a good point. Because me, at first when I thought about this question, I thought, well, of course, if you are high status, you are going to be more likely to say that you experience discrimination. And I mean, in the end, it's true. And that's what I was saying, is that it was Stanley Bailey et al. That's what they found. And they said, oh, well, like the US, we find something true. But if I was only going in with the US framework, I would say, well, I think that high status, more educated Afro-Brazilians are going to be more likely to acknowledge discrimination. And that's why I also pointed out that a lot of those organizations, the formal organizations involved with black activism in Brazil, were largely led by middle-class people, because those are the people that acknowledge racism. However, when we look at their work, and again, that's why I pointed this out, and there are, you know, plenty of examples. There's an example I didn't put up here, but I can read the quote. That kind of highlights that, of course, discrimination exists, but the way people interpret it is very different. So for a lot of the professionals, they're not saying that it's discrimination, you know, if someone is a doctor and is mistaken as a nurse. And again, this happens so often. That's why one of the reasons that I think we have these results is that people aren't considering it discrimination because it's so everyday. So this is a quote that I just want to read. I would detest being served by a black doctor or lawyer. The phrase was attributed to a professor of economics and was uttered during a class debate on Monday afternoon at the Federal University of Espiritu Santo. During the discussion, most students left the room outraged with the professor's attitude. He said that the cotistas, quota students, could not keep up with the classes like other students, and because of this, he had to use a more accessible language and lower the level of his class so that everyone could understand it, said one of the 19-year-old students. So this is just an example of a professor in class who is saying he would not want to be served by a black doctor or lawyer. If you think that's racist, you can. If you don't think it's racist, you know, it's up to you. But the fact is that what I'm saying is that in reality, these black doctors or lawyers, unless, you know, I think unless it was that explicit, if it was just kind of these other everyday things, they wouldn't necessarily consider that to be discrimination. So that's the part, in terms of what you were saying, would probably be different in the United States, right? If someone, when people mistake me as something else, you know, whether that's janitor or whatever, I might think that's racist. I'm not going to say, oh, this person just had bad manners. But in the Brazilian context, that is how they are interpreting those type of experiences. And that is different. That I agree with you. Yes?
Yeah, this is sort of honing up on this question. When I was in Brazil in 1967, nobody wanted to identify with being preto, of course, except if they were very preto. You know, they had people like Cabo Verde, which were black people with straight hair. You have the Taite Sarará, you know, the light skin with reddish, kinky hair, et cetera, et cetera. And they all considered themselves to be within that, you know, divided up into different little categories. And my question is really, why do you necessarily lump Pardo with Preto? Because Pardo, I think the people who identify as being Pardo might even be like indigenous people with, you know, mixed race people. Mixed race people don't necessarily, even though they might have black DNA, don't identify with being black. So what is actually the modification? What does actually Pardo mean, and what is its, it doesn't mean mulatto. So what is its justification of, to lump it with Preto to form that 58% or 53%?
Okay, so part of this is what Brazilians do. Again, going back to what actual Brazilians do.
Yeah, well,
So
yeah, they discriminate against Indians too. I mean, I'm not saying they're not discriminated against.
Well, I'm just saying in
Yeah,
terms
yeah.
of the terms. So
Yeah.
the first thing is for the actual analysis, I don't do that. So that's why you can see in the results, they are actually different, right? So blacks are less likely than browns or pardos to say they have never experienced discrimination. So in this sample, the way I analyzed it is that they are separate. So people that say they are preto are more likely to say they have experienced discrimination. So that's one, is that in the actual analysis, they're not lumped together. In terms of the Brazilian media, they often use the term negros. Some people use the term Afro-Brasileiros or Afro-Descendentes, but those are usually activists. And sometimes, sometimes you see it in the mainstream media. But in general, the mainstream media lumps these two together. So they will say negros, like when I showed the income inequality, they put those two groups together, blacks and browns. Of course, black movement activists, they put the two groups together. When the president, when she talked about quotas for negros, she put the two groups together. So all I can say is that I am just kind of, this is only about negros or Afro-Brazilians for the work, but the actual analysis does split them apart. But again, this is just taking an approach that's based off of what is actually going on in Brazil. And I'm not saying that the two groups are the same, which is likely why you get the different results.
I have a question. So what was, in the questionnaire that they answered, in Portuguese, what were the words? Were the words preto?
Yes, in part of, because they're census categories.
Was the word preto used in the?
Yes.
Because that's not common to.
I know. Yeah. So that's why, so Melissa Nobles, for example, has a book. And this is exactly what she talks about. So she talks about Black movement activists who, it wasn't for the 2010 census, it was the census before that. They actually advocated that preto not be put on the census because it's stigmatized. They wanted the term negro. And so if the term negro was on there, I mean, you probably would have more than 53%. You would have a lot of people identifying as negro because it's, I mean, blackness is still stigmatized, but now you see it more in mainstream media. So, so that you would have had more people identifying as negro, and that was kind of what Black movement activists, they wanted a more accurate count.
Yeah.
So that's why they actually put these two together.
Yeah, but even in like when you split like that, if I would have to choose between being preto or pardo, a lot of the Black population would put pardo, even though if they identify as Black.
Yes.
Because the term preto does not, is like you have a survey here and you ask if a person is Negro or Black. People who identify as Black. And there, if you use preto, just like maybe, as you said, like, you know, very few people would identify as preto. And that's because of the term, not because of their identification. It is a pejorative term.
Yeah, I mean,
So the survey
depending on,
gets twisted. You know?
yeah, and again, it depends because, so preto can be used, it can be used as the N-word for sure. But it can also, doesn't have to necessarily mean the N-word. But again, it still is stigmatized. However, the thing that we do want to remember is that increase that I was talking about. So they got to the magic 51% because there was an increase in Afro-Brazilians identifying as preto. The brown, the pardo group stayed relatively the same. So why would it be that more people would identify as a stigmatized group? And that's why I was talking about activism before, is that people are, despite that it's stigmatized, people are embracing a Black identity. It's more common for people to say negro. And this is, yeah, exactly one of the things that Black movement activists worked on for the census. They wanted negro to replace preto for that very reason.
Apart from discrimination, I've been very impressed in Brazil by the cordial incorporation of various ethnic groups. So you have there's a Japanese, and you have much in the sciences, the Lebanese, Italians, which is all a mix. And well, it's not the central Portuguese identity to have that's been sort of very high. Rather, they're the target of a lot of jokes that you all know about the Portuguese. So that's really something on the side I find in Brazil, this very cordial incorporation of the different ethnic groups, without being, you know, maliciously contrasting them against the high Portuguese, much to the contrary.
Okay, so if you were to talk to you know, some Afro-Brazilians, they probably wouldn't say so cordial. I tried to pull this up, but it's basically a blog. So I already mentioned Blogueiras Negras. You all can feel free to look at that one. It's great. That one, because they talk about these issues of racism, and it's written by Afro-Brazilian women. So they don't find that Brazil is cordial at all. This is one that's accessible in English. It's called Black Women of Brazil. They are all Brazilian, all Afro-Brazilian women. But you will often see most of their stories are not great. They are very informative. But you know, as you can see here, at school they said that I must be good and bad because of being black after suffering from stereotypes that Brazilian society reserves for black women. Monique Rivera now heads her own organization. So a lot of these talk about police brutality, killing black people. They had this story about a black doctor in Brazil who wore her hair in dreads. And so I think it was her, I don't remember, was it another staff person, but they said that she was smelly. All these stereotypes said that her hair wasn't professional. Now, she interpreted that as discrimination, so that was a big deal. But this is just, again, one of those examples where you can actually see what Brazilians are talking about. Black Brazilians are called monkey every day. So, just an example of how Afro-Brazilian women interpret these circumstances. It's not being very cordial to them. Yes?
I want to revisit my question again, but from a different perspective. You know, in Colombia, they say like 70% of the population is mestizo. They have a word, mestizo, and they 10% white and 15% black, and then some other mixtures. But mestizo, for them, is that equivalent to the term pardo in Brazil?
No, not exactly. So, okay, so I think one of the questions that you have, which you can't get at through survey data, so in some of my, well, in all of my work, I always have an open-ended question. And so that question is not limited to census categories. So then that's when some people, if they want to identify as mulata or mestizo, they can. But in general, pardo is a census category, whereas these other categories like morena, very common. Pretty much any Brazilian of any color can identify as morena, because it could just mean somebody with very light skin and dark hair. So it could be a white person with dark hair, they could identify as morena. It's a very ambiguous term. Right. But again, that's not, I mean, if your question is about ambiguity in terms of racial identification, the most ambiguous category that you could get at in the census would be pardo.
Yeah, okay, yeah. So I would say that, you know, they always talk, when I was there, they talked about the sub-raça brasileira, which has double signification, that they were unique as a race of people and that it was sort of below other races. So, yeah.
But that's, yeah, I mean, it just like the other person just brought up in terms of the question, if you are in a country where blackness is stigmatized, no matter what your skin color, if that's the only census category that you can check, then that's the one you would check, would be pardo regardless. And I've seen very dark skinned people that say that they are pardo, and sometimes they'll say, oh, well, that's what's on my birth certificate, but I'm really negra. You know, or it could be, you know, you don't want to identify as a stigmatized category.
Yeah, I think with independence of the various Portuguese-speaking African countries and activist movements in the United States, that willingness to identify with negritude is much stronger than it was in the past.
Yeah, for sure, and that's why, yeah, I had this slide that's actually talking about, you know, what's going on in Brazil today. So yeah, I mean, 30 years ago, we wouldn't be talking about social media. You couldn't pull up
Right, exactly,
blogueiras negras.
I noticed you didn't mention quilombismo as one of the movements there.
Yeah, that one, yeah. Yeah, so that is one that I could have mentioned. And the fact that, yeah, that land entitlement, you know, is granted based on proving, you know, if you are a Colombo community. Jan French has some work where she shows that in neighboring communities where some of these people are relatives, to gain land rights, some people are now saying that they are black. And, kind of creating a history to get those land rights.
Right.
Whereas, neighboring community, as well as more people actually claiming blackness and embracing blackness.
But, sorry about that, but the data that you're using from the laptop, that is self-reported? So
Yes.
so respondents report, I am black or brown for the...
Yes, based on census categories.
And what are the...
The census categories are preto,
Uh-huh.
pardo, amarelo for Asians,
Uh-huh.
indigenous, and blanco white.
And what is the proportion of blacks and browns in the sample?
In the
In the lab
pop
sample,
sample.
yeah.
Let me see. I have it here.
So it's, the question is really, are there more blacks or browns? So blacks, the group of blacks, the proportion of blacks is larger than the proportion of browns
In the,
in the lab pop sample?
no.
The other way
No,
around?
the pop pretty much mirrors the actual
That was going to be the
census one. Yeah, so I think, this is off the top of my head, but that's just saying 51% of the population identifies in census categories as preto or pardo. But yeah, as you are pointing out, of course, you have to look at DNA, it's much higher. And even this, I think they began to have, over majority status officially. That was in, I think it was 2010. But again, that's only going by census data, and that was due to more Afro-Brazilians identifying as preto. So these aren't real numbers. It's more of like about identification. And someone, I think one of the research centers, they're now saying is 53 or 54%. But these, again, aren't real demographic changes. It's based on self-identification. And that's all related to what I talked about before, affirmative action policies, as over 200 appraisals or something. So maybe that is having an effect on the results. And that is the end of the presentation. Thank you.
So we have like half an hour for questions.
Yes.
All of the research has been based on something which is being called color. And I just wonder whether there's been any research done on facial characteristics, face features. I wonder if that might be an element that should be.
Yeah, so, and I'm glad you pointed that out. So in here, as I said, so we have the two that's kind of getting in color. So one is actual skin tone, and then the other is how people identify as their race or color. In terms of the physical features, this survey doesn't have it. I'm actually doing some work right now where but it's only in 3 cities, so Salvador, Sao Paulo, and Rio, where I did collect data on hair type, physical, also skin color. I'm trying to think what else we have in there. We definitely have hair type and skin color. It's to try to get at some of the physical features that could also explain how people talk about discrimination. Yes.
The matter of preto, you have the 51%, and following up on this year, I think what one hears in terms of DNA in the Brazil population, it's probably closer to 100.
Yeah, so for the 51%, that is maybe 46 to 48% say that they are brown in the official census. And then the other, if it's 46 and 7%, this is for the 53% I was talking about earlier, are saying that they are preto. But yeah, but this one mirrors pretty much, I don't think I have it in here, but it's very similar. So you have more Afro-Brazilians that identify as brown. Oh, wait a minute, I think I might have it there. Okay, the 2012 survey has 1,500 respondents, and of the 1,449 responding to the color race question, 14%, actually I think that's 2010 survey, 14% self-identify as